My name is Dave Nave. Russell Ackoff brought new insights into managing the interactions between the parts of a company rather than managing the behavior of each part individually. He called this approach systems thinking, and his insights are a tremendous contribution to business and society. On behalf of the Deming Cooperative, we are pleased to make these videos available to you for your continued learning.
Okay, let's keep going. Downsizing. Oh, this is a beauty. Every time you downsize, stock goes up, right? And you have some phenomena like Chainsaw McGill, or whatever his name was, who took Scott Paper Company and downsized it to a bankruptcy. And as a result, he got a $14 million bonus and moved over to Sunbeam, where he downsized Sunbeam into bankruptcy and got another $20 million or so. What's wrong with downsizing? Well, that radical journal called the Wall Street Journal did a piece of research in which they showed that within 2 years after downsizing, companies' costs go up. Why? Why do they go up? Well, because, you see, the companies decided if we're going to downsize, what we want to do is be as considerate as possible. So we'll offer a golden handshake or the golden parachute, whatever you want to call it. An attractive voluntary retirement, right? Who takes those? The most competent people. Why? Because they're the people who figure they can get another job easily. The ones that don't take it are the ones that think they're going to have a hell of a job getting another job. So what you do is you weed out the good people and keep the bad ones. You discover this within 6 months, and you have to go out and hire them through consultants. It costs you twice as much as it did before. And so costs go up. But there's a more important reason than this. It is unethical. Boy, let me tell you, if there's any way to arouse the anger and antipathy of management, is to tell them that downsizing is not only inefficient, but it's unethical. And it's not necessary, and it's ineffective. What the hell are you talking about? Well, first let's look at the ethical question. Remember I said that a system is defined by its function and the larger system of which it's a part? What's the function of a corporation? Well, you have to talk about what's its role in society. 2 roles: to produce and distribute wealth. Right? That's what a corporation does. It is the only known way to man of simultaneously producing and distributing wealth. Every other way of distributing wealth consumes it. By productive employment, we produce wealth as well as distribute it. Now, how do we distribute wealth? Well, you put products out, you pay dividends, you pay interest on loans. But what do you think is the major way that any corporation distributes wealth? Employment. It's compensation for labor. Therefore, in order to perform its social function, it must maintain or increase employment. Downsizing is immoral. Now, I've had executive after executive say to me, what the hell are you talking about? I got 15,000 extra people. What do you expect me to do? Keep them on the payroll and go bankrupt? Of course not. But I do expect them to do something they don't ever do. And they say, what's that? And I say, think. I'll give you example after example of executive confronted with the problem of extra people who didn't have to lay them off because they took seriously their social responsibility of maintaining or increasing employment. Let me give you a couple. The Clark Equipment Corporation was on the verge of bankruptcy. Now, Clark Equipment is located in Buchanan, Michigan, just outside of South Bend, Indiana. They were the world's largest producer of forklift trucks, but they also made a lot of mobile construction equipment, excavators, backhoe loaders, front-end loaders, and so on. They got into a very serious mess because of the Japanese invasion of the American market A company by the name of Komatsu came in with much better equipment than anybody in the States was producing at a lower cost, more operable, easier to maintain. The Japanese simply took over the market, and Clark was on the verge of bankruptcy. The board, in desperation, had to blame somebody. It's the only thing they knew what to do about. So they blamed the CEO and fired him. Now they had to do something very quickly. They didn't ordinarily have to do that. They had to hire another CEO and do it quickly. And because they had to do it quickly, they did something they would never otherwise do. They hired a good one. They hired the president of General Motors Canada, a man by the name of Jim Reinhart, who was unhappy up in Canada. He was an American. He didn't like the political aspects of the job for General Motors. And so he took the CEO-ship of Clark, came down, and conducted an immediate study to find out what were the problems. One of the problems they identified was transportation costs. They had to distribute this heavy equipment to distributors all around the United States. They did it through a transportation department, had 450 people and 150 truck trailers. He found out he could save $20 million a year if he used commercial carriers, because the salary of commercial carriers was set by the Teamsters, whereas his salaries were set by a mechanical union that had a much higher, lower salary. So he called a meeting of 450 employees in the transportation department. I was lucky enough to be there. He said, "Gentlemen, I'm going to have to let you go. I can't afford you." And he showed them. If I go to commercial carriers, I'm going to save $20 million a year. He said, "Now, unfortunately, I can't just fire you." He said, "There are certain benefits you're entitled to under contract." He said, "This is how much it's going to cost." He went to the blackboard and wrote a number down. "This is how much it's going to cost for each one I let go." And then he multiplied it by 450 and came out with millions of dollars. He said, "I looked at that number and I thought, that's almost enough to buy the transportation department, but it's not quite enough." So I went to the banks in South Bend, Indiana, he said, and I asked them the following question. If I put up that amount of money, how much would they lend me to do a leveraged buyout of the transportation department of Clark? He said, "They offered me this amount of money," and he wrote it down. He added the two sums together. He said, "Now that's enough to buy the transportation department." He said, "If you do it, I will give you a contract for 2 years to do all the transportation for this company, providing you give me the same price as commercial carriers." And they did it. Nobody lost their job. They took an initial cut in salary because of the lower hourly pay. But within a year, they became the largest trucking company in the central, northern Midwest. All because a manager cared about maintaining employment. See, it doesn't have to be inside the company. But he felt an obligation not to let those people lose. Another example, General Electric was a beauty. General Electric was number 2 in the welding equipment business. A very weak number 2. Lincoln Electric has an almost monopoly on welding equipment. General Electric had less than 10% of the market and tried everything desperately to gain market share and couldn't succeed. It kept failing. So they finally came up with a strategy. We're going to build a factory that's almost completely automated so we can get the cost of welding equipment down so much that we'll offer welding equipment at a price so far below Lincoln that Lincoln's loyal customers will not be able to afford not to buy our equipment. That was the strategy. They built a new plant in York, Pennsylvania. Highly automated, one of the most automated plants in the United States. Bought the new products out at very much lower cost, and absolutely nothing happened to market share. So they came to Wharton, said, "Should we stay in this business?" Well, we did a study for them. We said, "No." We've talked to Lincoln's customers, and there is no price difference that you can offer that will make them shift. There were reasons for this, a loyalty to Lincoln that I don't have to go into here. So General Electric decided to go out of the welding business. They asked us, "What do we do about that brand new factory?" They offered that factory for sale at half of its value, providing who bought it kept the workforce. Within 2 months, they found a buyer who was tickled pink. They got a plant at a very low price with a workforce that could make it operate the day after they moved in, because they knew all the equipment, knew exactly how to run it. And General Electric made money out of that deal. How? Sold the plant at a big loss. Didn't have to pay any severance because all of the benefits were assumed by the new buyer. Again, all because somebody thought about the problems of continuing employment. I could give you all kinds of examples of other companies that have done the same thing. There's never a need to downsize. It always appears to be easy, but that's deceptive. It's easy in the short run, but not the long run. Peter Drucker said, look at the end here, there is morally and socially unforgivable. We pay a very nasty price for it. Look at that. Okay? There's plenty of reasons not to do it. Good alternatives are to debureaucratize, that is, destroy internal monopolies, make them compete for internal units. I want to give you a couple of examples of that. Mobil Oil, when they were located in New York on 2nd Avenue and 42nd Street, had a huge corporate computing center. It was the second largest civilian computing center in the United States, by the way, second only to Lockheed Martin at the time. They had 57 mainframe IBM 700 series computers. Now that's a big center. They did all of corporate computing because they required all corporate computing to be done in-house. The computing center was a subsidized center supported by a budget provided from corporate headquarters so that the users did not pay for the services they received. It was a terrible situation. The users complained that they got lousy service out of the computing center. The computing center said they were constantly being overloaded by trivial work that shouldn't have been done, and they hated each other. The CEO retired at one point, and the former CFO, Tavlarias, became CEO. We were doing some work there, and he called me in one day, and he showed me some interesting charts. He said, if I plot computing costs against salary costs, he said, within 8 years, we will be spending more on computers than we are on people. He said, maybe that's right. He said, my problem is I don't know. How can I find out what the value of the computing center is to the company? That's a wonderful question. And we were stupidly naive. We said, oh, we can do that. So we went out and found out what the computing center does. The two main activities was it scheduled refineries and it scheduled the ships that brought the crude oil from the Middle East to the refineries. So we designed experiments. We took the refineries, divided them in half at random, had one half run off of computer-prepared schedules and the other half to run off of manager-prepared schedules. We called the managers together and explained what we wanted to do, and they laughed. We said, what's the matter? They said, you can't do that. Why not? We never follow those computer schedules. Why don't you? Well, they leave out critical variables. We have to constantly adjust them. We said, that's okay. Just give us a record of the adjustment. What are you talking about? We don't keep a record of the adjustments. When we walk around the refinery, we see something wrong, we change it. We don't keep a record of all those things. And we struggled, and we could find no way of conducting that experiment. Now, the same thing happened with shipping. We couldn't run the experiments we wanted to. So again, we sat down and we thought about something I discussed this morning, Hitch's principle, which is if you can't solve the problem you're facing, you must be facing the wrong problem. This was a wonderful example. What were we trying to do? Here's a CEO asking a third party, us outside, to evaluate the performance of a unit inside serving other units inside. My God, what a complicated cycle. So who should be evaluating the computing services? Who should be? The consumers. They're the ones that have to accept it, but they don't now. Why not? Because it's a monopoly. They have no alternative. So we proposed to Tabula Reyes that he make the computing center a profit center that would charge for its services internally, but the internal customers would have a choice to buy the services inside or outside at whatever price they wanted to pay, but the computing center could sell the services externally. And he took that on. Within 1 year, they went from 57 to 35 computers. They were doing all of the internal work, which had been reduced by an order of magnitude because now that people had to pay for it, they weren't throwing a bunch of junk into the computing center. And they still had a lot of free time, which they were selling externally, and had the highest rate of return of any business that Mobil Oil was in. Data processing. All because they changed the financial structure of the unit by eliminating monopoly. Now, there are lots of other examples, but let's move on. Process re-engineering. You all know what process re-engineering is? This was the big thing about 5 years ago. It's still, despite the fact that Hammer, who invented this, had an article, a signed article in the Wall Street Journal in which he apologized for the fact that 75% of process re-engineered processes increased costs. He said he left something out. He sure did. 75% of the applications have been reported to be unsuccessful. What's the answer? Same thing. You see, in a normal business, you vertically organize, silos. When he comes along and says, that's wrong, what we got to do is have interaction horizontally. But how does he do it? By taking a slice horizontally. He doesn't realize that it's not the direction of the slice, it's the slice that makes the difference. It's a different kind of part, but it's still a part of the whole that he's manipulating and not considering the effect of the improvement of the part on the whole. So it's a wonderful example of anti-systemic change. Okay, so much for panaceas. We could go on indefinitely with this. Let me come here and go to the next one. This is one that I love. This has become a great new topic in management circles. It has a wonderful history. We've been talking about creativity for years, but like the weather, nobody was doing anything about it until a young man in England by the name of Edward de Bono came along. De Bono was an instructor at Cambridge University who's now a multi-millionaire running around the world teaching people how to be creative. But he had married and had a child, and he was a compulsive record keeper. And every day he would keep a record of what the child had done that had never done before. Today he said, ooh. Tomorrow he said, ah. And he recorded all this stuff. And he found out the rate of creativity of this child was just tremendous up until the time went to school, and then it began to flatten out. So he said, children are born creative. And look at adults. God, you're duds. Hard to find any creativity in adults. Why? Now, he never answered that question. Somebody else did. Two people did. One was an American anthropologist by the name of Jules Henry, who wrote an incredible book called Culture Against Man. And the other was a British psychiatrist, Ronald Lang, who wrote a book called The Politics of Experience. And they described how we kill creativity in children. Although de Bono never answered that question, what he did do is find ways of resuscitating creativity in adults, of what he called creativity enhancing programs, and that's where he's made his money. He runs around running courses on how to become more creative. So we've learned a lot about creativity. We've learned about what kills it in children, and we know a lot more than De Bono knew about how to resuscitate it in people. We discussed this briefly this morning, so let me repeat that every creative act is an act which involves 3 steps. First, you identify an assumption which you make, which limits the number of alternatives that you consider in a choice situation. Okay? Secondly, you remove that assumption. That increases the number of alternatives that are available to you. Okay? Then you explore the domain of increased choice. That's all creativity is. Those 3 steps. Now, what happens? Well, unfortunately, I don't have a chart here. I'm going to have to describe this verbally, and I hope I can do it. When my daughter, who is now on the arts faculty of the University of Indiana, was about 8 or 9 years old, I came home from work one day, and I came through the side door, and it took me through the so-called family room, which was a converted porch divided into 2 parts, with my office in one part, the family room in the other, with a connecting door. She looked up as I came in and said hello, and she said, "Will you help me with an extra credit problem I have in mathematics?" I said, "Yeah, see me after supper and we'll take a look at it." So I forgot all about it, and after supper I went into my study, was deeply involved in something. And she came in and stood beside the desk patiently, and I looked up and said, "What's the matter, Karen?" She said, "You were going to help me on that extra credit problem." I said, "Oh, yeah," and I clearly expressed my annoyance at having to stop what I was doing. I said, "Give me the problem." So she handed me a sheet of paper which had something you've all seen, 9 dots forming a square, and 3 dots across, 3 rows of them. The instructions said, take a pen or a pencil, put it on one of the dots, and draw 4 straight lines that cover all 9 dots. So I said, "Oh, I did this when I was a kid." She said, "That's fine, just show me the answer." I couldn't remember the answer. So I said, "Well, let's see what the problem is." And so I started doing the normal thing, and 1 dot was uncovered. I said, "Well, the trick must be 2 diagonals." So I tried 2 diagonals, and now 2 dots were uncovered. I worked on it for about 10 minutes and couldn't find a solution, and finally got disgusted and said, "Look, you said this was extra credit, so it's not important. Forget about it. I got to get back to work." She grabbed a sheet of paper from me and started to walk out of the room muttering audibly, "And you're supposed to be a university professor." She went into the next room, left the connecting door open, and in a short while I could hear her sobbing. I found it very difficult to concentrate on what I was doing with a sobbing youngster next door. So I went in and said, "What's the matter now, Karen?" She, through her sobs, said she was ashamed to go to school without a solution to that problem. So I said, "Well, I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was that important to you. Come back in and we'll make a real effort." So she came back in. I sat her down across from my desk, and I was standing behind my desk holding a sheet of paper with the instructions on it. I said, "Karen, is this a puzzle or a problem?" She said, "It's a puzzle." I said, "That's right." "What's the difference between a puzzle and a problem?" She said, "I don't know." I said, "Well, think." She said, "A puzzle is harder than a problem." I said, "No. There are problems that we don't know how to solve, and nothing is harder than that, and there are puzzles that are easy. Try again." She said, "Well, a puzzle has only one solution." I said, "No, there are problems that have only one solution, and puzzles that have many." I gave her some examples. "Try again." "I give up," she said. "You tell me." I said, "A puzzle is a problem you can't solve because of something you incorrectly assume." So I said, "What are we assuming about this problem," holding this sheet of paper, "that prevents us from solving it?" And I said, "Oh my God, look what we can do." I took the sheet of paper and folded it so that the bottom 3 dots were directly on top of the upper 3 dots. You got the picture? Took a felt tip pen and drew a line across. And then I unfolded the paper. I now had 2 horizontal lines, right? 2, 3, 4. Cover it by folding the paper. She was tickled pink. She grabbed this sheet and started, I said, wait a minute. She said, what's the matter? I said, we can do it with 1 line. She said, I don't care about that. The problem is 4 lines. I said, you made me stop my work to do it your way. Now you stop your work while I show you how to do it with 1 line. So she impatiently stood there. I took the paper, folded it across the top 3 dots, folded it across the bottom 3 dots, and brought them both up on top of the middle 3 dots with a little space between them. Then took a felt tip pen and drew a line, unfolded the paper, and I had 3 lines with 1 line. She didn't care. She grabbed the sheet and ran. So the next day when I came back home, she was again alone in the family room. The other 2 kids weren't there. But she didn't look up. She didn't say hello. So I said, hello, Karen. And she grunted at me. I said, oh, come on. What happened? She said, where? I said, in school. With what? She said, come on, you know what I'm talking about. She said, I don't want to talk about it. Why not? Because you're going to get mad, she said. I said, that's right, I can tell I'm going to get mad. But I won't get mad at you. So now tell me what happened. She looked up, she said, you promise? I said, yeah, I promise. She said, the teacher asked the class if anybody had a solution to the 9-dot problem. And about 10 kids in the room raised their hands, and she called on one of the other girls. And the other girl was called up to the front of the room, went to the blackboard, and showed the class her solution, which consists of drawing outside the square. If you take the top 3 lines and carry outside the square and then come down on a diagonal, you can do it with 4 lines. Oh my God, that's the one I used to know when I was a kid. I said, what happened? He said, the teacher congratulated the girl, patted her on the head, told her to sit down. I said, what did you do? She said, I raised my hand. The teacher said, what's the matter, Karen? She said, I have a different solution to the problem. The teacher says, don't be stupid. There's only one solution to the problem, and you've seen it. Now, don't interrupt again. I said, what did you do? She said, I waited a minute, and I raised my hand again. I said, what did the teacher say? She said, Karen, are you going to talk about that problem again? And I said, yes, because I have another solution, and I know I do, because my father is a university professor, and he showed it to me. The teacher said, I don't care who your father is. That problem has one solution, and you've seen it. Now stop interrupting. If you interrupt again, I'm going to have to put you out of the class. So I said, what'd you do? She said, I waited a minute and I raised my hand again. I don't know where she got her stubbornness, I think. The teacher said, what is it this time, Karen? She said, Miss So-and-so, I can do it with 1 line. Now at this point, the class came apart. You see, the class was uninterested in the argument between my daughter and the teacher as long as it involved 4 lines. They had seen it done with 4 lines. But 1 line. The teacher is now in the embarrassing position where the kids are curious as hell. So she said, all right, Karen, if you want to make a fool of yourself, come up to the blackboard and show the class how to do it with 1 line. My daughter said, I can't do it on the blackboard. The teacher said, why not? She said, I can't tell you, but I can show you. If you give me an easel and a pad, I'll show you. So the very angry teacher went to the storage closet on the side of the room, brought out an aluminum easel with a pad. My little daughter stood in front of it and drew the 9 dots very carefully, and then began to fold the paper. When she said, wait a minute, what are you doing? She said, I'm folding the paper. The teacher said, you can't do that. My daughter said, why not? The instructions didn't say I couldn't. The teacher said, I don't care what they said. That's what I meant. Now you sit down. You see, my daughter learned something very important that day that you all learned, and which dictates a large part of your lives, because you went through the same experience. The experience is when a person in a position of authority asks you a question, what's the first thing you ask yourself? What answer do they expect? The trick is not to find an answer, but to find the answer that they expect. When I work in a corporation on a problem given to me by the CEO, and I meet with the vice presidents to discuss the problem, what do you think the first thing they ask me is? What answer does he expect? What kind of answer does he want? Okay. The one thing you can be sure of is that when you give somebody the answer they want, it can't be creative, because a creative answer must surprise the person who receives it. It must be something they do not expect. I learned this a very hard way. By the way, on my daughter's 18th birthday, she gave me a present, which was a paper-bound book, the title of which was 1010 Solutions to the 9-Dot Problem. Okay. We really do kill creativity. I got fed up with graduate students' handwriting. I never used examinations, I used term papers. And they turned in a 15 to 20 page paper written illegibly, and I got disgusted. So one year I came into class and I said, you're going to have to typewrite your term paper. I went in on 8.5 by 11 unlined white paper, double-spaced typing, 1-inch margin on all 4 sides. Is that clear? All the students went, yes. Good. At the end of the semester, I got this beautiful set of papers, easily read, all typed neatly, but I got one paper that was typed horizontally across the sheet. And at the bottom, at the very end, it said, gotcha. Now, my initial inclination was to flunk him because he knew damn well what I wanted. But then I stopped and said, look at what he did. He met all the requirements, and he found out a way to surprise me. That's creative. So I gave him an A+, but wrote a note. Said, next time you do it, it won't be creative. But that's the way we kill creativity. We lead people into providing us with the answers that we expect or want, rather than asking, surprise me. That's not the message that we deliver when we ask people to solve a problem. What we ask them to do is give us what we want. Okay. These are the requirements of good management: competence, communication, caring, courage or guts we talked about, and creativity. Creativity is the 3-step process that I just referred to. Identify a limiting assumption, remove it, and explore the consequences. Some of the principles that help you in being creative is, first, deny the facts of the case. Let me just take the first of these examples. Bell of Pennsylvania called my group and me into their offices one day where I met with the president and the vice president of personnel. He said 42% of our employees are black, but less than 0.5% are in supervisory or management positions. If we don't do something, we're going to get in serious trouble, they said. And we agreed. They said, can you find out what we have to do to educate the blacks so they can move into management positions? So he said, well, that's a problem we would like to look at, but we don't want to accept your formulation until we know that the problem is a lack of education on the part of the blacks. He said, well, you can rest assured it is. We said, well, do you have any data to show it? And he said, what do you mean? He said, we would like to get access to the educational records of black women and black men who work at Bell and do a design experiment. We're going to take 500 women and 500 white women in the same jobs and compare their educational level. We want to take 500 men black, 500 men white, and compare their educational level. They said, we can't give you that information. Why not? They said, well, it's distributed around the system. We said, well, that doesn't bother us. We got graduate students and they're cheap. We'll collect the data. They said, oh no, we can't let that data out. So we broke the contract. It was one of the few times when we ever did. By sheer chance, a couple of weeks later, I was in New York and I ran into an old friend of mine who was a senior vice president of AT&T. And he said, hey, I hear you're doing your work on minority employment at Bell of Pennsylvania. I said, no, that got called off. He said, it did? Why? And I told him. He said, wait. About a week later, I got a phone call from the vice president of personnel, said, we've reconsidered, we think we'll give you the records. So we went back and we collected the records. It turned out that matching these people across in the same jobs black women had 1.5 years more education than the white woman in the same job. The black men had 3/4 of a year more education than black men in the same job. So our report to the company, we said, you got an educational problem, but it isn't how to educate blacks to be managers, but how to educate white to accept blacks as managers. And they broke the contract. When the contract was broken, we told them, you're asking for trouble, because if we could find this out, somebody else is going to find it out, and you're going to be sued. And they said, no, it's too hard to get that data. 2 years later, I had a class action suit taken by the black employees and got the highest judgment against them the corporation ever got for minority discrimination. It cost them millions of dollars because it was easy to establish that the bias had nothing to do with education, it had to do with race. So, deny the facts of the case and find out what they actually are will normally open up possibilities you might otherwise consider. The stewardess problem I just mentioned briefly was done with United Airlines, which assumed that stewardesses hate to fly, and therefore you had to minimize the number of flying hours they did each month. When we worked with the stewardesses for a while, we found out that was absolutely false. What they didn't like was having to spend free time away from home. Because in those days, by the way, you had to be unmarried to be a stewardess and had to have a degree. And their boyfriends were at their base. And they wanted to spend their free evenings with their boyfriends, not in some strange city. So we designed a way for scheduling the stewardesses so that we increased their time at home by 1/4 of their time, 25%, but increased their time of flying by 25%, and they were tickled pink. You see, the assumption that they don't like to fly was absolutely false. What they didn't like is spending spare time in a strange city, sitting in a hotel room. Remove externally imposed constraints. There are all kinds of wonderful examples of that. One of the most interesting ones I ever encountered was with the Air Force. The Air Force sent us a request for a proposal, said, how do we combat an intelligent source of noise which is jamming our communication circuits using game theory? So we wrote back and said we will not submit a proposal for 2 reasons. One is we never submit proposals because picking somebody to do research on the basis of proposals like deciding what car to buy by reading the advertisements. The way you pick somebody to do work is find out who's used them and what experience they had with them. But in addition, we said whoever wrote this thing doesn't know a damn thing about communication and even less about game theory. That's stupid. We literally said this in a letter that was 1.5 pages. We got a telegram back that said, you got the contract. It was a 3-year contract that went up then close to $1 million while we studied this intelligent source of noise without the use of game theory. You see, they made an assumption that would have restricted their ability to solve that problem, because the solution had nothing whatsoever to do with game theory. It had to do with the theory of human communication. Well, influence those who cannot be controlled. Bear Manning is the largest producer of abrasives in the United States. After World War II, they doubled their volume of sales within 10 years, went up 100% increase, but their profits only went up by 10%. So they wanted to know why. The reason was that their inventories went up 4 times. There was a 400% increase in their inventories to get a 100% increase in sales, and the cost of the inventories more than canceled out the increased profit from sales. So we said, the problem is that you're not selling enough to customers at a time. The average sale was for 3 days' supply to a factory of abrasives. They said, you can't do it with quantity discounts. We said, why not? He said, because the abrasives are on the backing, have a backing of cloth or paper, and if it's not humidity controlled in storage, it curls, and then it's spoiled. So companies buy only as much as they can store in a non-humidity controlled place for no longer than 3 days. So they won't buy quantity. We have to stock for company trucks coming around in 150 warehouses spread around the country for 3 days' supply at a time. So again, we stop to think about the thing. What can you do to decrease the amount of production that's necessary to meet demand that's for 3 days at a time? Well, if you stop and reflect on it, you deny a fact. And that is, suppose you knew a month in advance what they're going to want 3 days at the end of the month. Then you would only produce to what they need. The critical thing is how far in advance do you know what they're going to want? Therefore, we designed a system of prices where the price of abrasives decreased with the amount of notice that the company had as to when it would be picked up. So if they gave you a week's notice, you got one price. They gave you 2 weeks' notice, you got a lower price, and so on. And that was worked out so that the additional gain to the company was divided in half between the customer and the company. They reduced inventories by 75% by denying an assumption, you see, that you can't control the ordering behavior of a customer. But you could once they had an advantage given to them of doing it. Unilever, I got to tell you the Unilever story, and then I'll stop on this point. Unilever introduced frozen fish to England. It's a completely integrated business. They had a fleet of fishery boats that went out, caught the fish, threw them into a hold where they were kept alive until they came ashore, where they were taken to a freezing plant where they were prepared and put on the market. Unilever had a huge sale promotion to induce British women to use frozen fish. And the British women were delighted with this possibility of getting fish that were good tasting and fresh and so on. And they went and bought the frozen fish in droves once. It did not repeat. So Unilever sent out a bunch of market researchers and said, why didn't you continue to buy the frozen fish? They said, it doesn't taste right. It doesn't have the taste of fresh fish. It's not as good. So Unilever called in the chemists and said, why a frozen fish have a different taste than fresh fish? Now the answer was pretty ingenious. They found out why. They said, because the fish are not exercised. What do you mean? When you throw the fish into a tank on the ship, they're alive and swimming. But that tank is so filled with fish that they can hardly move. And therefore, there's a muscle deterioration in the fish who are not swimming. So when you come to freeze them, it's not the freezing that changes the taste. It's the fact that they've been inactive in that hold that causes the flavor. So the question was, how do you keep fish that are in a very crowded tank active? Oh boy, the solution was ingenious, and this is absolutely true. They put a baby shark in there. They would lose a couple fish on the way home, but boy, they had well-exercised fish. And frozen fish was very successful in England. So again, enlarge the system that you're looking at, bring in the hostile fish, and you got the problem solved. Role reversal, I'll just mention one case. In this so-called urban black ghetto that we worked in, the shopping area, the stores were closing because they were being robbed blind. Shoplifting was prevalent. And they knew that the shoplifting was primarily by young people who were gang members. So we talked them into hiring the gangs as a police force to protect the neighborhood, which they did, and all theft stopped. Once you converted the gangs into a police force, the amount that they paid them was trivial compared to what they had been losing by shoplifting, and the economy completely changed. I wish there were time to take you through an idealized design of an automobile. Start from scratch on an automobile. Let me just show you some of the things that happen when you start from scratch. How many people on the average are in an American automobile? What? How many?
How many people? On average, 3 out of 10.
It's 1.2. 1 is the passenger, 0.2 is the driver. Okay? 87% of the automobiles in the United States, and by the way, Mexico also, because we did it there, 1.2. You don't need a 6-passenger car for 87% of the trips. What's the average speed of an automobile in urban America?
25.
17. So you don't need a Mercedes and go 135 miles an hour. Now, if you design an automobile that will carry 2 people up to 40 miles an hour, because at 40 miles an hour you get the maximum density of people on a highway, you can build a car that will sell for less than $3,000, which has a hook at one end and an eye at the other, so you can put them together in tandem. So you can buy another car that has no motor, just a seat, and put the kids in the back. You don't have to listen to them and haul them around. That car will cost $3,400 and go 84 miles to the gallon. See, if you design a sensible automobile, getting rid of the assumptions that go into the current car. You see, when the first automobile was built, it was a luxury item, and even the wealthy people could only afford one. By the way, you know what the Ford Model T originally cost?
$700.
$200. But this is an aside, but a couple students at MIT took as a master's thesis, if you had known in 1920 what we know today, what would have been the best investment you could have made in money? And the answer was you would have bought Model T Fords, that they have appreciated more than anything else in our economy. If you had brand new Model T Fords today, you could sell them and make a fortune out of it. Okay. The design of an automobile just starts with a bunch of assumptions that are wrong. For example, stupidity in automobiles is just unbelievable. Why aren't all bumpers at the same height? A bumper's not a bumper if it's not at the same height. And then you make them fancy with paint on top of them so that they completely destroy the use of it. How many of you have ever used a little car in an amusement park that takes a couple people with a pole that goes up and hits an electrified ceiling? Do you know how fast they get to go? They get up to 18 miles an hour. You can have 2 of those cars hit each other head on, and people laugh. You take an American automobile and hit a brick wall at 5 miles an hour, and you got $2,000 worth of repairs. You see, we know how to arrange the bumpers on a car, but we don't use it because we make assumptions about what people want rather than what they use. I had a marvelous experience along this line at General Motors. We did a lot of work with General Motors, and I was sitting with the design engineers one day at lunch. And I said, the trouble with you people, you don't know a damn thing about the consumers of your product. He said, what do you mean? We're consumers of the product. We know what we want. I said, but you don't know what people who aren't engaged in your activity want. He said, give us an example. I said, all right, let's take one common one. When it's raining and you have a wet umbrella, what do you do when you get in the car? Tell me how you keep yourself in the car from getting wet. Any of you ever figure that out? It's easy to do. If you want to design a place for a wet umbrella to go, it's quite easy to do. But they never thought of it. How many of you ever tried to haul a bicycle in a car? And do it without scratching the car? Or without lifting it up top, which my little wife can't do. There are so many things about an automobile that are stupid. On the other hand, there's one wonderful story about Honda. Honda observed that an increasing portion of the sales was going to unmarried professional women. So they got curious. Why are unmarried professional women buying Hondas more than they used to? So they set out a group of people just to watch these women. And they observed something interesting. Whenever the women got in the car in the morning, they were always carrying a bag. And what was in the bag? a pair of shoes because they were wearing Nikes or Reeboks, but they had a pair of dress shoes in the bag. So when they got to work, they took off the Reeboks or the Nikes and put on the dress shoes. But where did they put the shoes when they got in the car? That was a problem. If nobody was in the car with them, they put it on a seat beside them. But if they had a passenger, they had to put it on the floor, which was awkward. So Honda did a very simple thing. They designed a compartment to go into the driver's side door that would take a pair of shoes. See? They became responsive to the consumer by watching what the consumer does rather than what they say. So you can become creative then by redesigning products and forcing yourself to confront the assumptions which are common to them. Okay, let's take a break. Here, another 15-minute break, and then we'll come together for some more stuff. We're whittling you down. I want to take just a few more points and then throw the floor open so that we can engage in some discussion instead of lecturing. Three of the types of effects that can have a tremendous impact on the productivity of an organization that derive from systems thinking are these three up on the board here. So let me review them briefly. Remember I told you that Per Gyllenhammar had a study done in which he found that only 23% of what people knew that was relevant to their jobs were they allowed to use. Well, what keeps them from using it? The job descriptions. So one of the things you learn out of thinking systemically about an organization is get rid of job descriptions. Now, what do? You bring a person in and tell them where they're going to be in the organization. And say, look around. See what you think needs to be done that you can do. And do it. And if you see something that needs to be done that you can't do, find out who can do it and arrange for them to do it. Now, you'll be amazed at what that does. I did this a number of years ago with my secretary. My old secretary had retired, and so a new gal came in, a very bright young woman, and she said, "What's expected of me?" I said, "I don't know, you tell me." "Well, how can I tell you? I don't know what's out there." I said, "Well, you got a couple weeks, look around, see what needs to be done, and do it." She said, "Are you serious?" I said, "Yeah." She took that job at 1/3 of her previous salary because she thought it would be fun. In a very short time, she came to see me and she said, "Is it okay if I take some courses in finance in the night school at Wharton?" I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, you don't really have a financial officer in the center, and you ought to have one. And I think I could do the financial stuff if I knew a little more, as well as the job of running the pool of gals." And so she went to school. She became the financial officer. And within 2 years, she became the office manager. And she not only ran a large research center, but she ran a graduate program with 175 graduate students in it as well. All from a gal that came in as an ordinary secretary, so we just let loose to do whatever she saw that she thought she could do. It's liberating to do this to people. Now, you don't just say, "Go ahead and do it." You say, "Come back, let's talk about it. What is it you think ought to be done?" So they may not know something that you know that you can provide as guidance. But don't feel you have to tell them what's expected, because that limits what they can do. We have a set of unspoken rules about compensation and status that are tremendously constraining inside of organizations. There are two of them. One is that nobody can have a salary that's higher than his boss's. You stop and think about that. There's no rule that says that. But do you know of anybody in the business that has a salary that's higher than his boss's? It's very rare. Why? I mean, there are lots of people that are more valuable than their bosses. Why shouldn't they get more? I told a story over lunch, the true story about Xerox. Xerox had 30 people as a company when they invented the Xerox machine. That's all the whole company was. It was secretaries, everybody put together with 30 people. The Xerox machine was an instantaneous success, and the corporation blew up into a huge corporation within a couple years. In gratitude for the work done by a group of the designers who would design the first Xerox machine, they were all made executive vice presidents. But in the next 3 years, they didn't have a single new product. And that's what we were called in for. How come we now have 300 people in the research and development department, a whole new building built for them in Rochester, and we don't get any new products? What's wrong? So we found out who were the original people to design the Xerox machine and went and talked to them. And every one of them was unhappy. They didn't like their jobs. And we said, well, why don't you go back to the lab? They said, we can't afford it. What do you mean you can't afford it? Because my salary back there is such, my standard of living would have to backpedal a great deal. So I had to take this job in order to get the income I need for this stage of my family development. Well, the solution was we talked the company into giving these people the same salary they were earning as vice presidents, but putting them back on the bench. And within 6 months, they developed a color Xerox machine and the desktop Xerox. In 6 months, the same people did it. 3 years, nothing had been done. It's all because in our system, in order to promote somebody, you've got to change their status. And that's ridiculous. We found that 20% of the managers in the United States have one person reporting to them. Can you guess why? Well, we were curious about it since on the average in the United States, we have 3.5 people reporting to a manager. By the way, in Japan, it's 8.5. And Japan is right and we're wrong. We have 2.5 times as many managers per employee as Japan has. But why do we have 20% of the managers with one person reporting to them? Well, it's because Joe works for me. He's good, but he's at the top of the salary bracket of his status. See, he's at number 13, and he's at the top of the salary. But if I'm going to give him a higher salary, the only way I can do it is to promote him. So I promote him to a 14, which is a manager, so I can increase his salary. But now I got to assign somebody for him to manage. So you assign one person to him. And that's why 20% of our people are called managers but don't manage really, because we wanted to increase their salary. That's ridiculous. It shouldn't be necessary to increase status in order to increase salary. How do you set a reasonable salary? Well, there's a whole corporation. McGee will come in for a fee and tell you how to set the salaries of anybody, given their job descriptions. That's nonsense. Because the job description is what they're told to do, not what they're capable of doing. The way to set salary is to assume the following. Here's my subordinate. Once a year, at least, she'll come in to meet with me. And I must answer the following question. She's just told me she's leaving the company to go somewhere else. How much am I willing to pay her to stay? That's the only relevant question. How much would I be willing to pay her to stay? If it's more than she's currently making, I've been cheating her. If it's less than she's currently making, I should have let her go a long time ago. Or maybe her salary is right. The question is, how much is she worth, not how much is the position worth. So we have to review the salary review process. I was telling at lunch, it's a dirty trick, but in the university, it's very strict. Nobody can make more money than the department chairman. And the department chairman can't make more than the dean, and the dean can't make more than the provost, and so on. I've always, as an individual, I've never negotiated for salary. But I wound up being the highest paid professor in the Wharton School. How? I had to make the budget every year, and I always made sure there was one member of my faculty that was at a higher salary than I was. When the dean reviewed the salaries, he would call me in and say, "What the hell are you doing? You've got Eric making more money than you do. You can't do that. You're chairman." And he would raise my salary. And every year, I never negotiated salary, but I always had somebody on the budget at a higher salary than me, and he would always bump me up. So there are ways of playing the existing system, but you shouldn't have to do that. That shouldn't be necessary. Finally, the question of fun is a very critical one. We've done a lot of work, as I mentioned at lunch, for the Mars Corporation, which is the largest privately owned corporation in the United States. It was founded by Forrest Mars, who retired a number of years ago, and the company was inherited by two sons and a daughter who own it outright. And we'd done a lot of work with the old man, Forrest, but the younger Forrest and his brother John, we did some work with them, and after a while I ran into Forrest and he said to me, "You haven't been around the company for a while, why don't you come in, look around and see what needs to be done and make some suggestions to us?" Well, that's a nice invitation. So I went, especially since the company's all over the world. They have facilities in 42 countries. They're marketing in 147. So, it's an invitation for a world tour. Well, I didn't quite do that, but I did enough of it to come back and say, "You got a very serious problem. Since I worked here last, which was about 5 years ago, there's been a significant deterioration in fun." I said, "What do you mean?" The people aren't having any fun anymore. They're not happy. You used to walk around the company and people were cheerful and smiling in their faces, and it was all upbeat. You go around now, they're all depressed. They said, "Well, what's the reason?" I said, "You are the reason. You are depressing managers, and if you don't lighten up, you're going to have real suffering in productivity." So they said, "How can we put fun back in?" And we had a wonderful project at Mars. How do you put fun back at work? Well, the answer is basically simple: self-determination. It's very hard to have fun doing what somebody else tells you to do all the time. What's fun is doing what you want to do and finding out that what you want to do is useful and fitting it in to the right place. So it's very important that you evaluate your own work and the work of your subordinates in terms of how much enjoyment are they getting out of it. Again, the question, what would you do tomorrow if you had your salary guaranteed to you, is critical here. Because if you wouldn't come back to work tomorrow, it means there's something lacking in your work. You ought to find out what it is, so that you would come back if your salary were guaranteed and you didn't have to work, you would come back anyhow, because coming back is fun. Okay, that's as much as I want to take you on. Let me see here. I want to just make sure. That's it. That's what I thought. Okay, the floor is open for questions, arguments, issues, or anything else you would like to raise. So let's have some good arguments. Take your time, think of a good question or issue. Yeah.
If two companies are merging, what can we do to help make that successful?
The first thing you can do is make them realize that out of every 6 mergers, only one is successful. So the odds are that your merger is not going to succeed. Now, why? It's because the design of the merger is done by a few people at the top who then impose the design on the rest of you. We know how to produce good mergers, and let me give you a story to illustrate. When Reinhardt, whom I mentioned before from GM, took over Clark Equipment Corporation, the company was in very serious trouble because of Japanese competition. So he called a meeting of the top 75 managers at Clark and held this meeting for a week retreat at the Notre Dame continuing education center in South Bend because he was a member of the board of Notre Dame University. And their problem was redesign the corporation from scratch. Well, the managers thought this was crazy. Here's a company on the verge of bankruptcy where they can't do anything, and he's telling them to imagine they can do anything they wanted. But he insisted. And he convinced them they ought to do it, and that when they did it, they would find out why he made them do it. And they did. At the end of the week, they came out with a design that was exciting and inspiring, but didn't see any way of realizing it. They said to Jim, you know, what's the point? We can't even approximate that design of a company. Then Jim said, I want you to stay here another week. He said, we're not the only company in this position because Komatsu has hurt all the manufacturers of this type of equipment. John Deere, International Harvester, and so on. Assume in the next round that you can combine any companies that you want to into a merger. What's the closest approximation to your design that you could get? They said, what's the point? We don't have any money. We're on the verge of bankruptcy. We can't acquire anybody anyhow. He said, I know, but let's go through the exercise and see what will happen. They did, and they came out at the end of the week amazed. If they took 3 other companies, combined with themselves, they would have what they said could take the business away from Komatsu. That's how good it was. He said, what's the point? We can't get any of those companies. And Reinhardt said, how do you know? Well, he said, we know those companies. No, you don't. Let's go talk to them. They took a trip in the company plane. They flew over to Germany and met with the top executives of Mercedes-Benz. Mercedes-Benz owned a company called the Euclid Truck Company, which they bought from the United States 10 years earlier and had never made money out of. They presented what they had done, and Euclid Truck was one of the 4 components of this proposed merger. And the head of Mercedes-Benz said to Reinhardt, you know, that's the first thing we've seen which offers hope of a profitable Euclid Truck Company. We have never been able to make it profitable. We're willing to sell it to you. And Reinhardt said, I'm sorry. He said, I can't buy it. Why can't you buy it? We don't have any money. Mercedes-Benz gave them Euclid Truck, and they gave Mercedes-Benz 10% of the stock in Clark Equipment. So they left Germany with Euclid Truck, okay? Then went to Volvo in Göteborg, Sweden. Volvo has a wholly owned subsidiary called Volvo BM, which makes the same kind of related equipment. They met with Per Gyllenhammar, showed him the design. He said, this is very interesting. But it'd never work. He said, we've never been able to get German and Swedish management, let alone German, Swedish, and American management together into a productive and cooperative relationship. So culturally, it won't work. Reinhardt said, well, you may be right, but let's test it and find out. They hadn't talked to the Japanese yet. They took the top 3 managers of Clark, Euclid, and Volvo, put them into a design team to design a joint venture. In the meantime, they went to Japan, and the Japanese company they had selected couldn't join them because they had a 5-year contract with Deere, and they couldn't break that contract. So they decided to go with 3 companies. They came out with a detailed design, which factories would close, which distributors would be retained, what products they would make, which products they would drop, who would be the officers, what would their titles be, what would the corporate name be, where would they incorporate. It was down to a gnat's eyebrow. They proposed it to the boards of the 3 companies, and they accepted it. And they created the VME Corporation in Rotterdam, Holland. Volvo, Michigan, Euclid. It's there today and a very profitable company. See? Because they went through a design process involving the people who would have to manage it, not the people at the top who would sit there and look down below. There have been other examples of the same thing. But the people that negotiate that purchase or merger are the ones that think they know how to do the merging. and they're almost always wrong. We had a terrible one in Canada. Imperial Oil of Canada, which is Exxon in Canada, bought Texaco. Now, Texaco was a smaller company than Imperial Oil, but more profitable. So it was an interesting negotiation by the top, and they reached an agreement that they would absorb Texaco and all of its officers, and nobody would be let go for 2 years. Now, that sounds good, but it was the most stupid thing anybody could do. Why? Because all the Texaco people knew that in 2 years they were going to go. And by God, in 2 years were up, everybody went. They were let go. Texaco was a lot better than Imperial Oil, had better management. And so the company went to hell. Instead of letting the better managers from the smaller company do the managing, the ones in the more powerful financial position took control, and they weren't equipped to do it. And that's the thing you got to worry about. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned earlier that leaders require courage and so do the followers. Dr. Deming used to say, when you're trying to transform an organization, it's not for the faint of heart. Can you talk more about courage in transforming an organization?
Courage is a matter of what risk you're willing to take to get what you pursue, what you want. We are a risk-averse society, and that's because you get punished if you make a mistake. On the other hand, the only thing an economy pays off for in the long run is risk. If you want to be perfectly safe with your money, you don't earn any interest. The greater the interest that you can get, the higher the risk is. That's what in the long run society pays off for. So we are disinclined to take risks. As a result, innovation is rare, although we do a lot of talking about how to make companies more innovative. We don't make any of the changes that would make it possible. Let me describe 2 companies to you and imagine it, because this is real. One company gives an annual prize for the best mistake that was made last year. Can you imagine the company doing that? But they do. They have a banquet with a large cash award to the person who made the best mistake last year. It's defined as the mistake from which we learn the most. Another company has the following slogan all over the executive suites. The statement was made by the CEO. If you didn't make a serious mistake last year, you didn't do your job because you didn't try anything new. But if you ever make the same mistake twice, you won't be here next year. See, he had it exactly right. We have a very high tolerance for mistakes, but not for their repetition. You better learn from the mistakes. We will excuse any mistake if you learn from it. Now, the interesting thing is the CEO who wrote it after he had made a terrible mistake. And he was aware of the impact that had, because he found his own inclination was to pull back his horns. And he said, no, I can't do that. I have to be willing to make mistakes. But I have to be sure that we learn from each mistake that we make. So, is that the kind of question that you had in mind about risk? Yeah, we just got to be a little more, there's no such thing as a bloodless revolution. And I can understand people not willing to run the risk. It's easy to tell somebody who's got a wife and a sick kid with polio that's in an iron lung or something like that he ought to be willing to give up his job and go someplace else. I don't know the pressures that are on him not to do that. But you have to make a distinction between being a professional and being an employee. It's a very big difference. If a company hires a doctor and they discover that there's asbestos in the walls of the offices that is causing emphysema, they call in the doctor and say, look, we know you're supposed to report that, but we don't want you to do it because it's bad for the corporation. What will the doctor say? If he's a professional, he'll say, like hell, my primary obligation is to the profession of medicine, secondarily to the company. But if he's an employee, what will he do? I'll do what's good for the company. And that's a fundamental difference. If you're a professional, you have to have standards below which you're not willing to go and maintain employment there. One of the greatest illusions we suffer from is that management is a profession. It's not. Management's a form of employment. There are very few professional managers because they don't have standards that they can enunciate and insist that they be met in order to maintain their employment. I speak with authority because I've been kicked out of 3 universities. And it's not easy, you know. I was lucky I had a family that would tolerate it. But moving a family is very difficult, especially with kids in school and all the rest of it. But they understood, fortunately, my value system, and they supported me. But I could understand people who decided not to move. Yeah.
Can you tell us more about what got you kicked out?
About what?
Can you tell us more about what got you kicked out of the universities?
Oh, yeah. Eventually, when I got to Wharton, I started a program in systems that had no courses, no curriculum, no admission requirements, no classes. We had an educational program that each student designed, and they could design it any way they wanted to and bring it to a faculty group, present their design, and then once approved, that was it. If they wanted to change it, they could change it at any time. But it was built on a simple notion that the 2 best ways of learning anything are to teach it to somebody else. By the way, the American Library Association did research on this, and if I can remember correctly, 10% of what you see you remember, 20% of what you hear you remember, 30% of what you see and hear you remember. And it goes up. 95% of what you teach others to do, you remember. Okay? It was built on that principle. And secondly, apprenticeship. It's the most important way of learning anything. 2 interesting things that occurred to me. A number of years ago, the American Statistical Association, 15,000 members, had its 100th anniversary and decided to celebrate. So it canvassed its membership to identify the 4 living statisticians who contributed most of the development of statistics. They did what's called a Delphi technique. It's a repetitive survey. The first survey came back with 50 suggestions. They put the 50 out and down to 25 and finally got 4 after 4 iterations. Those 4 were invited to speak at the anniversary in New York. Not one of them had ever had a course in statistics. You can't think outside of the box if you're in it. The important thing about most fields, you know, Einstein was not a physicist. You know what Einstein was when he developed relativity theory? Does any of you know?
He's an examiner in the Swiss patent office.
He what?
He's an examiner in the patent office.
Yes, he worked in the patent office. That's exactly right. He wasn't a professor of physics. He later became a professor of physics after he had developed relativity theory, but he did that on his own as a clerk. The United States has only ever produced 3 great architects that are internationally recognized: Richardson, Sullivan, and Frank Lloyd Wright. None of them had ever had a college degree in architecture. Sullivan learned architecture by working in the office of Richardson. Frank Lloyd Wright learned architecture by working in the office of Sullivan. Okay? Apprenticeship. Well, that's what we did at the university. They didn't like it. Why? Well, that's where I really learned something. We had the largest graduate program at the University of Pennsylvania, had 175 doctoral candidates. They went out at the highest average salary of any graduates of the university, with an average of 21 job offers each. What was wrong with that? Boy, the other departments hated us like hell. You see, if we obeyed the rules, they wouldn't mind, but not obeying the rules and succeeding, you are a thorn in the side of convention saying, why don't you change? Because you could do better if you did. Furthermore, 50% of our students were transfers out of other departments. Ooh, yeah. So there's our problems. You can fail in a university and never go out of existence. They'll tolerate any amount of failure. They'll tolerate success if you follow the rules, but if you break the rules, boy, you're under constant threat. I could tell you a story you wouldn't believe. I'll just tell you one. We paid our graduate students who worked on projects. They're all projects for real companies that were paid. So our graduate students were all supported financially by the projects they worked on. And we paid our graduate students more than any other graduate students at the University of Pennsylvania. The Labor Management Department of Wharton School decided that was unfair. So they talked the dean into creating a committee to investigate graduate student salaries in the Wharton School. And they appointed the senior professor in labor management, Bill Gomberg, who's a friend of mine, to head this committee. I got the first subpoena. And so I attended his first meeting, boardroom with a big table and a committee all around the committee and me at the other end. And Bill said to me, you know what this committee is about? I said, yeah, it's about equalization of graduate student salaries. He said, right. He said, how do you feel about that? I said, I think it's a very good idea. He said, no, wait a minute. He said, I don't think you understand. I said, I think you don't understand. He said, what do you mean? I said, you mean equalization at the level you pay. I mean equalization at the level we pay. He said, you can't do that. Why not? He said, over 90% of the total research this university gets comes through the National Science Foundation. And they have an upper limit on how much you can pay a graduate student. I said, I tell you what, you better call them, because right now I have 2 contracts with them in which I'm paying the higher salary. They disbanded the committee. Now, I had that kind of constant effort to wear me down. They wanted me to take the statistical examinations that are admission requirements to the Wharton School. I refused. Why? He said, because that's about knowing how to use statistics without understanding it. We want our students to understand statistics without knowing how to use it. Because you can always go to a textbook and find the equation. But what you can't find in a textbook is understanding. They didn't understand this distinction. So we finally said, here's what we'll do. We give our students an oral examination in statistics. And we know what questions they are. We will give that examination to the faculty in statistics, and if they can pass it, we'll use their examination. They looked at our questions and they gave up. They didn't go any further. We had to constantly go through that kind of stuff because they kept trying to make us conform. I finally left 2 years before I had to because I was wasting too much time with administration. So in my day, you had to retire at 65. And I retired at 63 because I said, the hell with it, I can do what I want to do outside. What other questions or issues?
I've been here for several years, and the term vision statement keeps being put out. And vision statements I usually see are we'll be the best at this, we'll be the best at that. What are the characteristics of vision statements that you think give the most organization to follow?
The vision statement is not a motherhood statement. There's some very good tests. Most mission statements are just full of motherhood statements. We want to provide our shareholders with a superior return on their investment. Can you imagine anybody saying we don't want to supply our shareholders with a superior return on investment? You can't. Nobody would say that. Now, there's a principle of lobbying and logic that if you can't support the negative of a statement, then the positive of the statement is meaningless. So somebody says too much alcohol is bad for you. Can you imagine somebody saying too much alcohol is good for you? No, then the first statement doesn't say anything. Why? How much is too much alcohol? It's an amount which is bad for you. So what you're really saying is an amount that's bad for you is bad for you. And that doesn't say anything. So a vision statement has to be a design. This is what we want to be, not statements that simply conform to current practice with regard to morality. We want to be a good corporate citizen. Can you imagine some company saying we want to be a lousy corporate citizen? We want to provide our workers with challenging and rewarding work. We do not want to, a statement. There was an incredible test. There was an executive program in which there were 50 major corporate executives present. The people who ran the program got the mission statements of the 50 companies, removed the names of the companies, distributed all 50 to the executives and asked them to pick out their own. Not one could pick out his own mission statement. They're nonsense. They're general purpose mission statements. They don't mean a damn thing. A good mission statement has to inspire people. So, for example, when Tremec in Mexico said, we want to demonstrate that private corporations can contribute more significantly to regional development than the government can. That's an exciting idea. That's not motherhood. Okay? Pick a couple others. Eastman Kodak, Apparatus Division. We want to return all the employees of this division to Rochester, New York, part of their mission. Boy, did they excite the people who were distributed around the country. All wanted to come back home to Rochester. So it's got to be an exciting and inspiring idea that gets incorporated in, not just the usual kind of motherhood statements. Yeah.
On the higher system level.
On what?
On a high system level,
Yeah.
you've got a social group within a corporation. And there's a distribution of power, influence, wealth among those people. And as you described, there's a certain inefficiency among the people and their ability to perform. Do you see fundamental changes in that superstructure changing over the next few years? And if so, what are the main themes? So that
No.
people have an opportunity to contribute more and increase that satisfaction.
I don't see much change occurring. Most of the changes that do occur are politically motivated. They're not motivated by competence. That's equally true in the university as it is in the corporation. Somebody pointed out at lunch, it's who you know more than what you know that's responsible for promotions. In most organizations, if you know too much, you're a threat. DuPont had a very unique situation. They had a fellow by the name of Mike Gagan, who's an Irishman imported to this country, who was almost incomprehensible because of his brogue. But he's brilliant. He's a chemical engineer. And he's the one who got them into synthetic fibers. He saw the possibility and convinced R&D to go to work on the problem, and that produced nylon, which of course was the major development of DuPont. Later on, he was the first one to see composite chemicals. Chemicals made by combining several chemicals that would have properties that no single chemical had. And this became the next big wave of development in DuPont. And then he came up with a third idea. And they'd been tolerating him. He didn't work for anybody. He was free-floating in the company. He could do whatever he wanted to do, travel wherever he wanted to do, just come up with ideas. I wrote an article about him, by the way, which was called The Corp Jester, because that's exactly what he was. He made fun of management with good humor, but since he never wanted their jobs, they would tolerate him as long as he came up with productive ideas. But then he hit a third idea. He said, you know, the progress of the Western world consists of building intelligence into machines. So the computer represents a technological revolution in which we now have machines that can perform mental functions. Why can't we have materials do that? What we need are intelligent materials. He said, Mike, you're out. You know, you're just going wild. You're out of the thing. And so they encouraged him to retire, which he did. Shortly thereafter, they developed this glass, which changes its transmission of light depending on the amount of sunshine that can come in. It's intelligent glass. They've invented paints which will change their color depending on the light that comes to them. And I attended a conference on this with Mike when he was first starting. I'll never forget. One of the biologists went like this. He said, "You ever think about your earlobe?" He said, "Boy, that's smart material." Well, it seems surprising. What's so smart about this thing? It's absolutely at rest until I pull on it. And then its resistance is exactly equal to the pull. He said, if we could build materials that could sleep when they're not in use and only exert resistance to stress when in use, we could increase the life of a bridge or a building by an infinite amount. Well, you know, he said, this guy's nutty. If he wants to build steel, it would have this property. Well, people are doing it, by the way. By the way, Japan has made real progress in smart materials. So there's such a thing as being so smart you're out ahead of where anybody else is willing to think. And so you're looked at as though you're a nut. You know, Jules Verne was looked at this way. You're aware of that when he foresaw the submarine and a lot of other things. Any other thing? Well, I don't want to keep you beyond your patience. I'll just tell you one final story. It involved my son, who I haven't talked about today. He's the eldest of my three, and he's now in his 50s, but he was about 8 years old when I came home from work one day, and my wife said, you got to get Alan aside and give him a good talking to and punish him. I said, what's the matter? What did he do? He said, he struck Karen. I said, what do you mean? He said, he slapped her. Well, we're supposed to be a nonviolent family, and there's a no-no about slapping your siblings. So I got a hold of Al and said, I want to see you right after supper. I want to talk to you. He knew exactly what for, so he was a little shy, and after supper he came in, and I told him to sit down, and I started to give him hell. Now, after about a minute, I kind of ran out of things to say because I had a great deal of sympathy with what he had done, but I couldn't let him know that. So I paused, and that was a serious mistake. He said, Daddy, do you know what the one skeleton in the closet said to the other? Now, any parent in his right mind would have paid no attention. But I was trying to think of the next thing to say, so I stupidly said no. And he said, the one skeleton in the closet said to the other, if we had any guts, we'd get out of here. So let's do it.